Hi guys, and welcome back to some more English with Dry. Today we are on to part 2 of Act 1 of An Inspector Calls. The previous video ended with the inspector arriving in the Burling household. Edna, the housemaid, lets him in, and we are given a description of what he looks like. It talks of the impression of massiveness, solidity, and purposefulness in the inspector. Now, all of these words combine to suggest that he is very imposing. By imposing, what we mean is that people take him seriously. He appears at once as though people should respect him, and that is exactly what the Burlings feel instantly. And when I say respect, I don't necessarily mean a respect in the sense of they agree with his ideas, but they respect him enough to take him very much at his word for what he does and what he says. They are very much of the opinion that he is someone who is in charge of the situation, and indeed he immediately takes charge. Burling offers him something to drink to begin with, some whiskey, and instantly the inspector says, "No, I'm on duty." Now, we talked before about how alcohol in this play is a symbol. It represents the idea of responsibility, and the fact that the Burlings can drink as much as they want essentially shows that they have very little to worry about in their lives. The fact that the inspector doesn't drink presents him as different to them, firstly, which is important, but also it shows that he is a serious man who takes his job very seriously. But equally, it shows the idea that he is someone who takes responsibility for his actions. If we view alcohol as a motif in the play as a whole, indicating not taking responsibility, the fact that the inspector chooses not to drink suggests that that is exactly what he does. Immediately, Burling identifies the fact that the inspector is an impressive man and tries to, as ever he might, sort of assert his own authority back. He talks about how he was an alderman and also Lord Mayor. These past glories are things that have given him a certain amount of renown in the town of Brumley, and in his opinion, entitle him to preferential treatment. He's trying to show off his influence to the inspector, to intimidate him almost, as he has been intimidated by this man coming into his house. However, the inspector is uninterested in these attempts to dominate proceedings. He's uninterested in what Burling says about himself or the positions he's held. He seems to be singularly unmoved by what he says. And this is something that causes Burling some trouble. He talks about, the stage direction indicates that he talks with a touch of impatience, which very much implies that he is used to getting his own way, and it seems currently as though he is not. The inspector reveals that a young woman has died of suicide in the Royal Infirmary. Now, the fact that Burling is again impatient when hearing of this girl's suicide is a really stark juxtaposition of words, and indicates that he frankly does not care in the slightest about Eva Smith, or, as far as he's concerned, whoever this young woman is. All he knows is that his evening is being ruined, or in the very least interrupted, by this man coming to tell him some bad news. And rather than the natural reaction to a police inspector coming to your house to tell you that a woman has killed herself, which might be extreme sadness or anxiety, Burling's simply annoyed. And this is where Burling cuts him off. And as the doorbell interrupted him when he arrived, again it's an indication that the inspector has no time for what Burling says. He's not interested in hearing him talk about anything other than the case at hand. He also shows, by cutting through him, that he is in control. He says cutting through massively. Now, this adverb suggests that the inspector really can dominate Arthur Burling in a way that Burling did not anticipate would happen to him, especially in his own home. We hear now that the woman who died was named Eva Smith, and the inspector starts to question whether or not he remembered him. Burling responds, suggesting that we've several hundred young women working in his employment. Now, this reinforces how many lives Berling actually is in charge of. Now, make no mistake, he has the capacity to make these people much happier and much less happy. It also shows how little he cares about any of them, because he says they keep changing. It shows the high turnover of women that work for him, but it also shows how little he knows about any of them, and how little of an attempt he makes to find out anything more about any of them. And this is something the inspector reminds him of. He says Eva Smith, however, was out of the ordinary, and at this point he begins to show the photograph. Now, the photograph is an interesting one because it's something that, of course, the inspector shows individually to each character that Gerald ultimately realizes could indicate that he is not showing them the same woman. And of course, this is something that's never resolved in the play. However, both Eric and Gerald try to see the photograph initially, and the inspector denies them. He says it's the way I like to work. And so once more, this is him asserting his dominance and his control over the situation. He's reminding both Eric and Gerald that he is the one who is in charge. At this point, Berling really starts to become unnerved by what's going on. As I've mentioned, he's not used to somebody in his own home telling him what to do and being so much in charge of the situation. And this is what makes him restless. However, there's also a sense that this restlessness could be because he is beginning to remember exactly why he remembers Eva Smith, which is, of course, that he fired her. He talks about how he discharged her, which is, of course, a word that means fired or sacked. And this, of course, leads Eric to immediately question, is that why she committed suicide? Now, of course, if you are an employer and you fire or sack somebody, that is your prerogative to do so. However, Berling is not necessarily being judged purely for sacking someone. He's being judged for the fact that he is refusing to accept responsibility for the consequences of this action. We then get into the reasons why he decided to let Eva Smith go. We hear that it was because he refused to pay her more money, and she took the rest of the women out on strike. However, Berling, before he even acknowledges this, says, well, this can't have anything to do with the girl's suicide because it was so much before it. Now, this is a reminder to the reader, the audience, the inspector, and anyone on stage that Berling believes we do not play a significant role in the lives of each of those around us. We are not responsible for what happens to people. Simply because he sacked a woman does not mean that he can accept any sense of responsibility or guilt for the consequences of that action. Now, again, this is something that kind of sums up capitalism in Priestley's view, something that really epitomizes the kind of selfishness of this ideology. And it's something that the inspector immediately states, no, sir, I can't agree with you there. The inspector instead talks of a chain of events, which is something that he suggests Arthur Berling began. And this image reinforces the socialist view that really we are all connected in some way, that everything we do has, even if it's a small one, it has a small impact on those around us. And this is something that Berling finds very, very troubling. He says, there's something in what you say which shows that maybe deep down he does know actually. But he then says, I can't accept responsibility, which really could be the thing that sums him up better than anything in this whole play. He cannot accept responsibility, and indeed he will not accept it, because he does not accept that he can negatively affect the lives of those around him. He believes everything he does is in the interests of making himself money, making his business successful, and everything he does to do that is in the cause of achieving more himself. It's not so much to do with the idea of making other people's lives worse. Now, regardless of how you view Berling, you cannot necessarily say that he maliciously or deliberately tries to make Eva Smith's life worse. But what he is thoughtless and also ignorant of the impact of what he will do, of what he has done to her. Eric then reminds Berling that he was just in the process of giving a speech about such things But then Burling sheepishly says we needn't go into all that. It's almost like he knows the guilt for what he has done. Burling then starts to describe Eva Smith, and the first thing he says was that she was a lively, good-looking girl. Now, of course, the first thing he is talking about here is her physical appearance, and this sort of speaks to the gender roles and also the kind of Edwardian societal expectations on men and on women. It shows that his value of Eva Smith was first and foremost in her appearance. Now, of course, we've established Eva Smith was very pretty, and this is the thing that sticks out to him, and in a lot of ways it's the thing that's most relevant, which is interesting because he then says that she was working in one of our machine shops and she was a good worker. In fact, the factory foreman told me he was ready to promote her into what we call a leading operator. Now, for somebody like Burling, who pretends to be a hard-headed man of business, the fact that she is good at her job should be something that appeals to him. It should be something that's worth rewarding. But of course, the first thing he says is that she was good-looking. Now, this just reminds us, in case we were in any doubt, of the kind of societal misogyny that was at play in this time period. He describes how Eva Smith led a small strike because they were getting chronically underpaid. Now, he says that this was the same pay that was being offered to everyone. He says that this was, as in everyone in factories all around Brumley, he was paying the going rate, is what he says. And the inspector starts to question him on this, about why he refused to pay more money. And then Burling is completely put off by this. He says, I don't see that it's any concern of yours how I choose to run my business, is it now? Now, this speaks to socialism versus capitalism, because it's a key tenet of socialism that the state controls business, and therefore it would be the business of everyone how much individuals are paid for working, how factories and other such institutions as in businesses are run, and therefore that is probably why the inspector feels so comfortable asking him, why didn't you pay her more? Whereas to Burling, this is something that is at the discretion of the people who run businesses, and so for him it's a ridiculous question. Why should I pay Eva Smith more, he says. Now, he then continues about how it's his duty to keep labour costs down, and he says we pay the usual rates. It's a free country. Now, he's not wrong about any of that. Britain in 1912 was a capitalist country, as it still is. And he is technically correct that he has no legal obligation to pay Eva Smith any more money than what he is doing so. He is technically not wrong either in saying that she could, if she wanted to, have freely left his work and freely sought another job. This is all technically accurate. However, of course, it is not that simple. It is not simply as easy as waltzing out of the job as a young woman like Eva Smith and finding another one. Now, this idea of the simplicity of what Burling's saying is the thing that condemns him. Burling's inability to grasp how hard life is for a woman like Eva Smith, and of course, let's not forget Eva Smith represents all other women that work for him, that makes it something that is a key failing of Burling's, and it speaks to his ignorance. If you are looking at a perfect capitalist society where people can move around constantly and get whatever job they want, fine. But this idea of perfect capitalism does not exist any more than perfect socialism does. And this is why Eric says it isn't as if you can go and work somewhere else. Now, again, Eric is displaying an intriguing amount of awareness here. For somebody who is supposedly a drunk, a silly little boy, all the things that he's presented as initially, this is a very perceptive comment, because he's right. Eva Smith couldn't go and immediately get another job. Employment was very low at that time period. If you had a job, it was paramount that you kept it. And it's not like if you suddenly left your job, a lot of the people like Eva Smith would have a great deal of money to fall back upon, because they simply did not. The fact is, she needed that job, and being out of it for even as much as a week would have dire consequences. Now, it's interesting to debate whether Burling actually knows this and is being deliberately ignorant of it, or whether he genuinely believes life is easy for these women. I would argue that the fact that he himself didn't come from much, he himself perhaps came from a background not that dissimilar to Eva Smith's, means that he should know fine well how hard it is. And the fact he is successful has meant that he is deliberately avoiding it because it poses too many hard questions to himself. Burling and Gerald then agree that sacking a woman like Eva Smith who arranged a strike is a perfectly acceptable thing to do, because they're asking for the earth, i.e. they're asking for too much. But the inspector replies, it's better to ask for the earth than to take it. Now, this linguistic difference, ask versus take, is a nice contrast that is worth discussing, especially because it summarizes capitalism versus socialism again. It shows Priestley's belief that asking for something, of course, is politer, it is more pleasant, it's more friendly than taking. Taking implies a selfishness, it implies a refusal to acknowledge the needs of others. And that is really what Priestley is saying that socialism and capitalism are. At this point, Burling starts to get particularly irritated, and he decides to flex his muscles again. He says, how do you get on with our Chief Constable, Colonel Roberts? Now, this is the head of the police service in Brumley. Now, Burling starts to brag that he knows this man as a personal friend, and he does this to try and intimidate the inspector, almost suggesting, stop talking to me this way, because I know you're a boss. And it's also a way of reinforcing this kind of strict elite hierarchy, where a man such as Burling, who is, known around Brumley as being successful and wealthy, he also knows the person who's in charge of police. But the inspector is unflappable. He is uninterested by this. Burling continues, and he says, well, I play golf with him. And the inspector replies, stating that he doesn't play golf. Now, much like alcohol, golf is an important motif in this play, or rather a metaphor, because golf as a sport is probably the most exclusive and the most elitist sport there is. If you think about golf clubs, to even play the sport, you need to be wealthy enough in the first place to own the equipment. And then also golf clubs, as in the places you'd be members of, you have to pay to be part of one. You have to be recommended by somebody who's already there. You can't just join randomly. And then also, a lot of people aren't allowed in. There are some golf clubs in the United Kingdom that still don't even allow women members. And so golf is a perfect kind of description of this. Now, the fact that the inspector doesn't play it, and he says it dryly, I don't play golf, really he is saying more than simply, I don't play the sport golf. He's saying, I don't play golf, I don't subscribe to the worldview of golf, and I don't believe in anything implied by the sport of golf. I don't believe in this kind of old boys club and network of friends who only allow the rich to stay rich and only allow the people at the top to stay there. The inspector is a socialist. He's the mouthpiece of Priestley. And then this, of course, rankles with Burling so much. And he starts to get cross at this point. Eric says, kind of interjects, saying, we try for the highest possible prices, and I don't see why you should have sacked her just because she had a bit more spirit than the others. Now, he correctly identifies this hypocrisy of Arthur Burling, that actually Eva Smith has this kind of entrepreneurial spirit of being successful in the same way that Arthur Burling did, presumably. And this is something he really should admire. But of course, he has forgotten this idea. He likes to lecture about how anyone can aspire to be anything, anyone can be successful. But really, he doesn't want anyone to be able to be successful in the UK. He wants the status quo to remain the same. He doesn't want there to be more rich people, because then that means less for him and his friends. And so it kind of confirms him as this ultimate hypocrite, this person who says one thing and does something entirely different. And this is why he gets angry. He says he starts kind of mocking Eric and saying that he's spoilt and that he doesn't know what he's talking about, which is, they're all fair criticisms of Eric, but they don't excuse the fact that he is actually a hypocrite about these things. And then, of course, Eric goes on the defensive because his father is right. And Eric doesn't yet have the confidence in his own beliefs to truly stand up to his father. At this point, Sheila returns. And then later on, or rather very, very shortly, Sheila starts to be interrogated by the inspector. I hope you found this video helpful. We will examine the final part of Act 1 in the next video. Make sure you like and subscribe, and good luck revising.